Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to Jericho Road, where we're looking at the world of Jesus as it is told through the Gospel of Mark. And now we're nearing the end of a journey that we began last fall, and the story's getting pretty exciting. And hey, I want to remind you, we try to make this podcast as interactive as possible, and you can always email me questions at rwebster@st-lukes.com, or go to our website, click on my picture, rwebster@st-lukes.com. I'd be happy to answer your questions. This is the second in a three-part podcast where we're looking at the attacks upon Jesus in the last week of his life. Jesus left the safety of the Galilee and his friends and the miracles and the teachings and closed a chapter on that part of his life, and is now in the temple precincts where his enemies are circling, and they're good. These are big city issues with big city opponents, if you will. And last podcast, we saw Jesus responding to something, a trap that they laid for him because something that he did. Marching into Jerusalem on a colt, overturning the money changers. Today we see a trap laid for Jesus by Pharisees and Herodians because of what he said, a parable that he told. So let's read this and see if we can see something in a new way. It's Mark chapter 12, beginning with the 13th verse, ending with the 17th. Very famous story. They sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came in, they said to him, "Teacher, we know that you're sincere, and you show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it." They brought him one. And then he said to them, "Whose head is on this and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Jesus said to them, "Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." They were utterly amazed at him. They sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. This chapter begins, or this passage begins, verse 13. The first thing that you have to notice is that now that Jesus is in the city, as a common enemy, he sure makes some strange allies come together. Pharisees and Herodians would be strange bedfellows, to say the least. They would not really be in the same sentence or ever hang out with each other. Let's remember what we know about Pharisees. Pharisees were learned teachers and upholders of the law, so that people living in the world of Jesus could differentiate really from their Gentile neighbors. And also Pharisees longed for independence from Rome and the restoring of the Davidic kingdom. Herodians, as best we could tell, were much more accommodating to culture, which would make them enemies from the start. They were a public political party loyal to Herod and his dynasty. They too longed for independence, but they longed for a Herodian kingdom. In an earlier podcast, it was around Christmas time, we talked about Joseph and the birth of Jesus. We talked about Herod, and Herod tracing his citizenship, if not his lineage, to Edom, which is the land of Esau. And I'm beginning to appreciate that Genesis 25 is a pretty important chapter in the whole of our library that we call the Bible. In Genesis 25, we see God's blessing go to Jacob, who's the younger brother of Esau, simply because, well, Esau is a man who's ruled by his appetites. Well, fast forward 2 millennia to the world of Jesus, and we see a Herod, a nightmare king from Edom, from this lineage or citizenship of Esau. Herod and his children ruled by their appetites and lording it over others like any other hedonistic kind of ruler of the day. They weren't different in the way that the Bible asks us to be different. So now you can see why Pharisees and Herodians don't hang out. But Jesus is a threat to them, and a common threat to them, because of the story that he told them in the temple precincts. You notice the way that they loaded up on the front end too. They praise him, which is just, Jesus calls it hypocrisy. And in an earlier podcast, I talked about a city near Nazareth called Sepphoris, which was completely rebuilt during the entirety of Jesus' childhood, so that it's probable, if not almost certain, that Jesus would have worked there with his father as a tekton. We translate the word carpenter, but the word means laborer in the rebuilding of this Roman city. And when you walk into Sepphoris from the very beginning, you see the very, very opening of the road going into the city, a huge theater off to the side. And there's no question that Jesus would have labored there and have seen that theater and even seen plays enacted. And in the Greco-Roman world, which was also concurrent with the world of Jesus, you would have seen an actor wearing a mask to show mood, right? The actor would simply put a mask on or take a mask off, and these actors were called hypocrites. So this is the word that he uses for Pharisees and Herodians who are not friends, and yet they're so bound by their common threat to Jesus that he pins them with that name. I want to show you a picture of the Jezreel Valley because Jesus tells a story that enrages them and binds them together as a common enemy. The Jezreel Valley was and is the breadbasket of their world, and much the breadbasket of that part of the Roman world, and it is today as well. It's a long, wide valley, about 10 miles wide, and about 30 miles long. It's a huge thing, and there's a lot of industrial farmland out there, even as there was in the world of Jesus. So Jesus would tell parables based on what he saw all around him, like the Jezreel Valley in the Galilee. And what would happen there is that wealthy landowners would displace people who had lived on ancestral land for hundreds and hundreds of years, including people living in Nazareth up on the hill overlooking this valley. They had bad dirt up there, no jobs, but they're looking at land that would have formerly belonged to them, now belongs to someone else. And so if they lived on the land, they served as tenants for these industrial farmers, if you will, these absentee landowners. And we know something about this in the South, right? We know something about the legacy of slavery and then sharecropping in our own world and as residents of Alabama. You know, I talk a lot about archaeology in this Sunday school class, or this podcast rather, but you don't have to go very far to find some pretty cool archaeology. I want to show you a picture of a church pew in Montgomery. This is a very, very special little pew. It's from a church called Good Shepherd, which is the second oldest Episcopal church building in Montgomery. It was built in 1908 by freed African-American people. This is a significant site because the pews inside of Good Shepherd were the slave pews from St. John's, which had been downtown before. They simply gave these to the people. And what's remarkable about this church, and I would love for you to see it, all you have to do is call the good folks at Good Shepherd when you're in Montgomery. They will show you. This church was built for them and by them. They built a beautiful church building, and it was not given to them, but rather they built it for themselves, taking the pews that they had prayed in as formerly enslaved people now, praying as free people and worshiping God, which makes Good Shepherd in some ways an Ellis Island of the African-American economic experience and worship experience. It is a national treasure to see these pews. And again, all you have to do is call the good folks at Good Shepherd, and they would love to show you. Well, so we know something about tenant farming and slaves and industrial farms. And so Jesus tells a parable about this. He tells a parable about a landowner who went to claim his share of a vineyard. And he has these wicked tenants who beat his slaves again and again when they go to collect. There we go. And it happens again and again until finally they even kill a slave. So he decides to send his beloved heir. Now, this word beloved is a loaded word. It's a provocative word. Beloved is what God said at Jesus' baptism. This is my beloved son. This is what God says at the transfiguration. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. This is even the word used for Abraham and Isaac at the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. Take your son, your beloved, if you will, and sacrifice him. This is a provocative word because right away, those hearing this parable can see that Jesus is talking about him. And when the son is killed in this parable, the landowner then destroys the wicked tenants and he gives land to the others. And then Jesus quotes Psalm 118, and this is what he says. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Okay, I think the three strands of meaning in this parable, and three threats, if you will. Three threats to the Herodians and the Pharisees, but three things that we can get from this. From Christians, we can see this is a prediction of what's about to happen, right? Jesus will be killed, and on 3 days later, he will rise again, and there'll be an opportunity for a new kingdom and new opportunities for access to God through Christ, if you will, salvation of the whole world. We all get to claim to be children of Abraham now through Jesus' atoning sacrifice, and on and on and on. We'll preach that sermon again as we get closer to the Passion. But there's a more general application too. And what we see here in this parable is what happens in a disordered world. A disordered world rebelling against the precepts and the gifts of God. A disordered world that rejects God's commandments and lives according to their appetites. There is no logic, there's no compassion, only murder. and only destruction. And then finally, thirdly, I also believe this is a story of the power of martyrdom. According to a late Roman historian, a 5th century historian, in fact, the gladiatorial games in Rome ended with a martyrdom. It happened like this. Rome had been supposedly a Christian country for at least a century or almost a century, and yet there was a monk named Telemachus who watched the gladiatorial contest in the Colosseum and was just appalled. So he stepped out into the arena to stop the fight, and the crowds were so enraged by this disruption in their entertainment that they threw rocks and stoned him to death. And the emperor was so impressed by this martyrdom that he wrote an edict and ended the gladiator games forever. It ended with a martyrdom. A death can change things. And the Herodians and the Pharisees know this. They've watched Jesus act provocatively again and again, by the riding in on a colt, the overchanging of the money changers, now telling a story that places him, if you will, in the position of power through sacrifice. And so these strange bedfellows set a trap that they believe he cannot escape. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? That's the backdrop of the question. Oh, it's a hot button issue. Mainly because in the world of Jesus, which is the 1st century, Rome was already an empire suffering from a decline. It was overstretched, and it was already an empire suffering from financial instability. I'm no economist, but as best I can tell, it works like this. In the early days of the Roman Empire, the expansion of the Roman Empire, which would be about 150 years before Jesus, Rome was flush with cash. Every time they would burn a city like a Corinth, that money would flow right back into Rome, and they had so much money that the emperors threw pennies in the parades. No taxes, everybody had all they wanted. But standing armies are expensive, and empires are expensive. And over 150 years ago, the wealth began to shift from west to east because Egypt was now the breadbasket that fed this giant machine. And so all the money that was used to spend on the wheat remained in Egypt. And so now the bread would go west and the money would go east, but you see, you can grow some more wheat. And so at some point there was an imbalance in the empire. How do you get money back to Rome so that they can buy more bread? You get it back to the capital through taxes. And in the world of Jesus, and taxes were high. In the world of Jesus, there were 3 kinds of taxes for Jewish people living in Judea, which was a direct Roman tax zone. One, you had the half-shekel temple tax that all Jewish people paid, and then you had indirect taxes that would just bite you everywhere, including in the Galilee. This would be taxes on customs, or taxes or duties, or travel taxes, or taxes on just about everything, including the road you traveled and the cart you pulled your produce in. And then if you were living in a direct Roman zone like Judea, you had the Imperial Tax, which is the one they really hated, which was a head tax for both men and women as adults, and it consisted of 1 denarius paid annually for the privilege of living in Rome. Taxes began the Zealot movement that would end with the destruction of the temple in 70. So this shows you how they felt about it. And it was the hot button issue, and they thought, well, good. If he says that it's not lawful to pay the taxes, they can have him arrested. If he says it's lawful to pay the taxes, they can turn the people against him. They feel like they've got him in an impossible situation. And in response, Jesus asked for a coin. I'll show you a picture of a Roman coin. Roman coins were the mass communication of the day. They would show you who was in charge. They would show you which regime, if you will, you had to be loyal to. But alone of all the nations of the Roman world, which is pretty much the whole world that they knew, right, with the Mediterranean Sea in the middle as a Roman lake, the Judeans were different in that they had their own coinage. Their coins were aniaconic. It just means they didn't have an image on them according to the laws of Moses. They might have a sheaf of wheat or a menorah or something like that, but no heads, no faces. So you didn't have that, which is why you had the legitimate business of the money changers in the temple, right? The turning over of coins so that you could conduct temple business. And so Jesus asked for a coin, and immediately we see more hypocrisy. Remember that important word, actor behind a mask. The Herodians and the Pharisees are not really good guys. And now we see the hypocrisy when one of them pulls out a coin that has a head on it. He's not supposed to have that there. So right away the coin accuses them, if you will. And Jesus says, whose head is on this? Now the word is better translated image, and it connects us directly to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, and it clears up a misperception. Genesis 1:27 says that we're all made in the image and likeness of God. Hold that thought. I think many of us were raised on this story to think that this was a story about, well, there's church business and then there's business. Well, there's the government business and the church, and don't confuse church and state, right? That sort of that. Well, it's not really about that when you connect it to Genesis 1:27, and it also brings us back to why I believe again and again and again that the story of the exile is an important backstory when it comes to understanding the world of Jesus. It's an important backstory that is hardly ever spoken of, and yet we can't get away from it. 600 years ago, or 600 years before this scene, rather, 600 years before the world of Jesus, God's people lost everything when the Babylonians destroyed their city and their temple and took them far away to live in a faraway land. But here's what they learned. God was way out there with them too. God called prophets just like he did at home. God would speak to them, speak words of comfort to them, and promise them that they would go home. They were not abandoned. And that became a very, very important shift in their own development of faith. You see, they left with an incomplete understanding that we might call monolatry, which they thought they were called to be loyal to God, but there were many other gods all around them. Perhaps they believed that their God was a local God or a God in place, right, with a temple in their home, a God for them there, but other gods in other places. They left as people who were believers in monolatry. They came back as monotheists, which is to say that God is over all. God is over them all and always with them and always had been with them, and now they understood. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Whatever is the government business is whatever, but God is over all. God is over the emperor. God is over the slave. God loves each and every one of us equally, and justice matters at any level, right? Kindness matters at any level. Love matters at any level. He just refuses once again to go there. I believe this points to a very, very practical theology for us, this story, this response to the challenge, if you will. First of all, it's once again another example of Jesus refusing to confuse means with ends, Jesus refusing to go there. Taxes are simply a means to run the government, but our end is union with God and with each other. They're asking the wrong question. But I like to think in stories, and I think I'll give you one from my own childhood, if you will, to show you how this can help us with a very practical theology to see God over all. When I was a younger man, my beloved church in Montgomery had a split, and it was a split over many forces outside of Church of the Ascension. This was a day when there were lots of social issues that were dividing the church, and lots of good people, lots of good families just divided from each other, and it was heartbreaking on both sides. We had my own family left the Church of the Ascension, and they were heroic in their giving and in their sacrifice and in their wanderings, if you will, until they could find a new home. The people who stayed back at the Church of the Ascension were heroic, and they were sad, and they wondered why the church was suddenly half the size that it had been, and they missed their friends. And both missed their friends. And when you go to Montgomery today, you could see that both congregations are all mixed up with each other by blood and marriage and history, and it's just something that you just don't go there. And I'm going there because something important happened to me. I had a conversation with a beloved old priest who was my mentor and my daddy in my earliest years when I became an Episcopalian. And his name is Mark Waldo, and he's now gone to heaven to be with Jesus. And he was a wise and a funny man. And I remember asking him what he thought about the split and if he had been to the new church. They built a church on the other side of town. And I guess I was being a little gossipy, and he knew that, and he refused to go there, and he taught me a valuable lesson. I said, Mark, did you ever see the building? Have you seen it? Have you seen what it looks like? He goes, oh yes, Rich, it's terrible. They have side aisles. See, we didn't have side aisles at Ascension. You just had a center aisle, and everybody knew if you had to get up and go to the restroom, the whole church could see you. And what Mark was doing in a very wise and funny and generous way is to say, Rich, we're all God's family. We're all God's people. There should be a church on every corner in Montgomery. There should be a church on every corner of our cities. I mean, we split and we divide and we do sad things, but God is over all. God, and when the gospel is proclaimed, then God is pleased, because we're just simply a means. Our churches are a means to an end, which is union with Christ and union with each other, which is making the world better and different and kind. And so all these other things are what humans do, but what God does, God restores. And God unites, and God makes us a family. And so what we see here is a practical theology when God is over all. Well, I hope you're beginning to see that in these attacks, Jesus is not merely eluding his attackers, if you will, but also teaching us right up to the cross on how to live and not confuse means with ends. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you next time.